He had already turned the engine off. That was the detail people would remember later. The engine was off. The field was half done. The bales were lined up straight behind him, tight and even, the way he liked them. At 10:47 that morning, Thomas Carlyle shut down the tractor, climbed down, and sat beside the rear tire. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in more than 20 years, there was nothing left to do for a few minutes. He did not know that this would be the last quiet moment of his life. He did not know that the decision he made 22 years earlier, standing in a gravel lot outside Watertown, South Dakota, had been counting down to this exact morning. Back then, on June 14, 1983, he was 47 years old and worried about milk prices, not his heart. The dairy was failing slowly, which is worse than failing fast. Milk prices had been falling for 3 straight years. The bank had made it clear that his operating line of credit would not be renewed unless something changed. He had 180 acres, 64 head of Holsteins for sons, and a mortgage older than his marriage. His wife, Anne, had not bought herself a new winter coat in 6 years. She never mentioned it. He noticed anyway. That morning in 1983, he stood in the equipment lot at Hendricks, New Holland, listening to Vernon Oakes explain stainless steel pipelines and automated feeders like they were the future arriving on schedule. $48,000, financed over 7 years at 11.5% interest. Vernon said everyone was moving this direction. Vernon also said, gently, that Thomas could not keep doing what he was doing. Thomas knew that. He also knew his father had died in 1971 on land that carried no debt. He had always believed that mattered. A man who owned his land outright was a different kind of man. That belief had shaped him more than he admitted. He walked away from the modern milking parlor before Vernon finished talking. He told himself he needed to look around. In the back corner of the lot sat a used New Holland 855 round baler, 4 years old. 9,000 bales on the meter, paint chipped along the pickup teeth, 1 hydraulic line replaced, $7,200. Finance it over 3 years. That was a number he could swallow. That was a number that did not feel like surrender. He asked Vernon what a man could make doing custom baling. Vernon said that depended on the man. Thomas stood there longer than he needed to. He was not choosing between 2 machines. He was choosing between 2 versions of himself. One borrowed big, modernized, competed with larger operations, and risked everything. The other kept the dairy small, worked longer hours, and tried to make up the difference with sweat. Vernon finally said, "You're going to work yourself to death, Thomas." Thomas signed anyway. The baler arrived on a Thursday. He learned it the way he learned everything alone. Adjust belt tension. Watch the windrow. Keep the pickup teeth clear. Don't overfeed it. He practiced in his own fields first. Then the calls started. The first contract came from Earl Havacek, who ran 40 head of beef cattle and whose back had given out that spring. Thomas charged $1.75 per bale, 340 bales in 2 days. Earl paid cash. Thomas put the money in an envelope and paid down part of the loan early. That envelope felt like proof. By the end of that first summer, he had worked for 11 different farms. Mornings in the dairy, noon until dark in the fields, evening milking. His oldest son, Jacob, 16 that year, helped with the cattle and kept the books and called customers and reminded him to eat. He made $4,100 from custom baling that first year. It was not enough to grow. It was enough to continue. That was the beginning of the trap, though he did not see it. Custom baling did not run on a schedule. It ran on weather and reputation. If rain was coming in 3 days, you worked until the field was done. If you said you would show up at 6, you showed up at 6. If you turned work down, someone else took it, and next year they called that man instead. Thomas learned to read the sky. He learned which clouds meant hurry and which meant you had time. He learned to sleep in short blocks and eat standing up. By 1986, he had steady customers and raised his rate to $2 per bale. Some complained, none left. He paid off the baler to payments early. He bought a second rake the next year. On paper, the decision looked right. The dairy stayed small. The milk check stayed flat. But the custom work grew. By 1988, he was baling more than 4,000 bales a season. 4,000 times he climbed down from the tractor. 4,000 times he checked tension and moisture and alignment. 4,000 times he told himself this was temporary. Jacob graduated high school and stayed on the farm. That felt like validation. Maybe this would carry forward. Maybe the long hours would mean something beyond survival. His second son, Michael, left for college in Brookings and later took a job in Rapid City. Thomas told him that was good. Not every son had to farm. He meant it when he said it. But he also noticed the silence in the barn felt different without all four boys there. In 1991, Thomas turned 55. He had been running on urgency for 8 years. His knees hurt in the morning. His lower back stiffened if he sat too long. A cough started in April and stayed until October, and told him twice to see a doctor. He said he did not have time. That summer was dry. Smaller bales meant more acres to make the same money. 12-hour days became normal. Sundays were for maintenance and catching up. Jacob, 22 then, began talking about getting his own place. He asked if the farm could support two families. Thomas did the math in his head before answering. No, not like this. Jacob moved to Sioux Falls 2 months later and took a job at a feed mill. Thomas hired a high school kid to help with milking. The baler did not slow down. In 1995, the rain came and did not stop. First cutting rotted. Contracts canceled. He made $1,800 that summer from custom work. The dairy lost money. The bank restructured the operating line and raised the interest rate. Thomas signed and did not tell him how tight it had become. He told himself next year would be better. In 1996, milk prices dropped again. The co-op penalized inconsistent production. Some months he was paid in full. Some months he was paid 70 cents on the dollar. He thought about selling the cows. He did not. Without cows, it would not be a farm. It would be a man with a baler. That distinction mattered to him more than it should have. In 1998, Paul came home with a degree in agricultural business and ideas about grants, rotational grazing, expanding into silage. Paul said the farm needed to change. Thomas said there was not enough money in it. Paul said that was exactly why it had to change. Thomas said no. Paul left for Iowa that June. By 2000, Thomas was 64. The dairy still ran. The custom work still kept the payments current. He still woke before dawn and told him he needed to slow down. He said he would soon. He had been saying that for years. His youngest son, David, worked in IT in Minnesota. Michael was a CPA. Paul was a regional sales manager. Jacob managed the feed mill. None farmed. Some nights, Thomas wondered whether he had worked so hard to preserve something that no one else wanted. He never said that out loud. The summer of 2003 was hot. 12 contracts, 7 days a week. He told Ann he would hire help next year. On July 18th, he was baling for Roger Dietrich 20 miles south of home. 96 degrees. He had been running since 6 that morning. At 3:30, he felt tightness in his chest. At 4, his left arm ached. He shut the tractor down and told himself it was the heat. He walked 10 feet and collapsed. The ambulance took him to Watertown. The doctors said it was a significant heart attack. They said he was lucky. They said he needed to reduce stress. He stayed for days. Then he went back to finish Roger's field. He told Ann the work did not stop because he had a heart attack. That was true. It just was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that if he stopped, everything he had held together for 20 years might finally fall apart. And so he kept going. He kept going until the morning he shut the engine off and sat beside the rear tire and closed his eyes. But that morning was still ahead of him in 1983, when he signed for a used baler because it was the only choice he could live with. He did not know that sometimes the choice you can live with is the one that slowly takes your life. And the machine he chose, dark blue and ordinary, would work exactly as promised. That was the problem. It would work well enough to keep him from quitting, and not well enough to let him stop. Thomas told himself the hardest year was behind him. That is how men like him survive long stretches of strain. They draw an invisible line and decide everything before it was the worst of it. By 1986, the baler was paid off to payments early. and that fact mattered more to him than he let on. He would run his hand across the steel frame sometimes, not with pride exactly, but with relief. It no longer belonged to the bank. It belonged to him. That distinction kept him upright through long days. He raised his rate to $2 a bale that summer, and waited for complaints to turn into cancellations. They did not. The same farmers called again. Some grumbled about fuel prices and margins, but when rain threatened, they still called Thomas. Reliability is a currency in rural counties. If you show up when you say you will, you get the next job. He showed up. That became his quiet brand. The dairy continued exactly as it had before: 64 head, morning and evening milking. Equipment that should have been replaced but wasn't. The milk check did not grow. It hovered. The custom work grew instead. 4,000 bales in a season meant 4,000 small confirmations that he had made the right decision. 4,000 proofs that he could outwork the problem. What he did not count were the hours. Those were not as easy to total. Jacob ran the baler some afternoons once he finished with the cattle. Thomas watched him closely the first few times, correcting windrow approach, reminding him not to rush corners. Jacob learned fast. He had a steadier hand than Thomas at that age. Sometimes customers complimented the boy. Thomas nodded and accepted it as if it were his own praise. He began to imagine a handoff one day, gradual, quiet, earned. He did not say that out loud. Saying it would make it fragile. Michael called from Brookings and talked about accounting classes and internships. Thomas listened politely. He asked practical questions. He did not ask whether Michael missed the farm. When Michael later took a job in Rapid City, Thomas told him that was good, that stability mattered. He meant that too, but he noticed that the family table felt larger each year. In 1988, the custom list grew long enough that he began scheduling weeks in advance. That should have felt like success. Instead, it felt like obligation. If rain appeared in the forecast, his phone would ring before sunrise. He learned to answer with energy even when he had none. If he sounded tired, they might call someone else next time. The baler never broke down in any dramatic way. It did not give him a reason to stop. That was part of the problem. It worked. It worked in dry years and decent years and in years when hay quality was mediocre, but acceptable. He replaced belts when they wore thin. He greased fittings religiously. Maintenance became ritual. Ritual became identity, and kept track of every invoice. She wrote amounts neatly in a ledger and circled payments in red when they came in. She knew which customers were slow. She never complained about the hours, but she began to notice the way Thomas ate standing, quick, distracted. She would put a plate in front of him, and by the time she turned back, it was empty, though he barely remembered tasting it. In 1990, he began waking at night not from worry exactly, but from momentum. His mind would run through the next day's fields before dawn. Which farm first? Which direction to start to avoid flattening windrows? Whether the forecast would hold. He stopped setting an alarm. He did not need one. By 1991, he turned 55 and felt older than that number suggested. The cough that started each spring and lingered into fall became part of the background noise of his days. He told himself it was dust and said it sounded deeper than dust. He waved that away. That summer was dry and the hay came off light. Light hay meant more acres. More acres meant more hours. 12-hour days no longer felt exceptional. They felt required. On Sundays, he told himself he was resting when he only worked half days in the dairy and caught up on repairs. He began to measure rest in fractions. Jacob, now 22, started asking practical questions. Could they expand? Could they add head? Could they borrow and modernize after all? Thomas answered with numbers. The numbers never quite worked. The dairy was not losing dramatically. It was losing quietly. Custom baling filled the gap, but only because Thomas filled every hour. When Jacob asked whether the farm could support two families, Thomas did not hesitate long enough to soften the answer. He said no, not like this. Jacob did not argue. He moved to Sioux Falls 2 months later and took a job at a feed mill. Thomas told neighbors it was good for a young man to see the world. He did not mention that he had once imagined handing Jacob the baler keys. After Jacob left, Thomas hired a high school kid to help with milking. The kid was willing but inconsistent. Thomas began doing more himself again. That pattern repeated over years. When help failed, he absorbed the gap. In 1993 and 1990 for the seasons were average. Average is dangerous. Average does not force change. Average tells you that endurance is enough. The baler crossed milestones without ceremony. 20,000 bales, 30,000, 50,000. He sometimes glanced at the meter and felt a flicker of pride, then a flicker of something else he did not name. Time measured in rotations. In 1995, the rain did not stop. First cutting rotted before it could be baled. Contracts fell through because fields were too wet. He lost nearly half his expected custom work, $1,800 that summer, instead of what he had planned. The dairy lost money at the same time. The bank called in September and asked for restructuring. Interest rates rose. Payment schedules tightened. Thomas signed without negotiation. He drove home slowly and did not tell on how close the numbers had come to breaking. He told her they would manage. They always had. That phrase began to replace actual analysis. In 1996, milk prices dropped again, and the co-op penalized inconsistent butterfat content. Some months he was paid in full. Some months he was paid 70 cents on the dollar. He started calculating margins in his head while driving between fields. He thought about selling the cows more seriously than before. He imagined the barn empty. He imagined mornings without milking. The thought did not bring relief. It brought shame. Without cows, he told himself, it would not be a farm. It would just be custom work. That line hardened inside him. Paul returned from college in 1998 with spreadsheets and optimism. He talked about grants and rotational grazing and diversifying income streams. He talked about leverage as a tool, not a failure. Thomas listened and heard risk. He heard interest payments and dependence. He heard his father's silence about debt. When Paul suggested applying for funding to modernize and expand, Thomas said no. He did not say it angrily. He said it firmly. Paul argued that doing the same thing and expecting different results made no sense. Thomas answered that the same thing had kept the lights on for 15 years. Paul left for Iowa that June. After he drove away, Thomas stood in the yard longer than necessary. He told himself that sons were meant to find their own paths. That was true. It was also easier than admitting that the farm could not hold them. By 2000, Thomas was 64 and operating on habit. Dawn, milking, fields, invoices, maintenance, repeat, and suggested a weekend trip to the Black Hills. He said maybe after the second cutting. There was always a second cutting. The custom list remained steady but not expanding. It did not need to expand. It needed only to continue. Continuation became the goal, not growth. Not security, just continuation. His body sent quieter warnings, now longer stiffness in the morning, deeper fatigue that sleep did not erase. He adjusted by starting earlier. If he could not outlast the day, he would get ahead of it. In 2001 and 2002, the seasons were again average. Enough hay, enough checks, enough strain, enough to avoid collapse and avoid transformation at the same time. That was the true false stability. He told and he would slow down soon. He said that word often, soon. It meant nothing specific. It meant not today. By the summer of 2003, he had 12 contracts and less patience for delay. Heat pressed down in July and fields dried quickly. He worked 7 days a week because weather did not honor rest. He told himself he would hire more help next year. He had said that before. What he did not say was that hiring help meant trusting someone else with reputation. And reputation was the only asset he believed he truly owned. The baler's meter climbed past 100,000 bales. He did not celebrate it. He simply noted it and kept moving. Every season that passed without collapse felt like proof that he had chosen correctly back in 1983. But each season also narrowed his options. He was too invested to pivot, too tired to reinvent, too proud to abandon. The stability he had built was real, but it was built on his presence. Remove him, and it would not hold. He knew that in the abstract. He did not apply it to himself. The trap was not dramatic. It was incremental. Each year added another layer of just enough income, just enough health, just enough hope that next year might be lighter. He did not notice that the margin for error was shrinking. He only noticed that tomorrow's field still needed to be done. And so he kept the list in his head, kept the phone charged, kept the tractor fueled, kept telling himself that endurance was wisdom, that continuity was success, that the life he had chosen because it was the only one he could live with would eventually justify itself. He did not see that false stability is hardest to leave precisely because it never collapses all at once. It asks only that you return tomorrow, and he always did. By the late 1990s, the farm was no longer a question of growth. It was a question of containment. Thomas did not talk about expansion anymore. He talked about holding steady. Holding steady meant the dairy stayed at 64 head. It meant the same milking equipment kept running past the point most neighbors would have replaced it. It meant the baler handled more of the financial load each year, while the dairy quietly slipped behind it. The numbers were never catastrophic. That was the problem. They were manageable. Manageable meant no one forced change. In 1998, when Paul stood in the kitchen with papers spread out across the table, pointing at grant opportunities and alternative grazing models, Thomas listened with the patience of a man who had already decided. Paul spoke about margins and diversification and reducing dependency on volatile milk prices. He spoke about leverage as strategy. Thomas heard debt. He heard obligation. He heard the bank officer's careful tone from years earlier asking whether he had considered selling. The memory had not faded. It had hardened. When Paul said the farm needed to evolve or it would slowly die, Thomas answered that slow dying was better than gambling everything at once. Paul looked at him for a long moment before saying that slow dying was still dying. Thomas did not respond to that. Paul left for Iowa that summer and took the job with the seed company. Thomas told neighbors that Paul had always been business-minded. He did not mention that part of him felt accused. After Paul left and asked quietly whether Thomas thought he had been too firm, he said no. He said there was not enough money in it. He said the farm could not support another family. That answer was factual. It was also defensive. By 1999, the distance between Thomas and his sons had shifted from geography to philosophy. Jacob managed at the feed mill in Sioux Falls and talked about efficiency metrics and distribution networks when he visited. Michael spoke in terms of tax codes and investment timing. David discussed software systems and remote access. They respected what their father had built. They did not want to inherit it. Thomas never asked directly whether any of them would come back. He told himself that farming was not something you forced on a boy, but in the quiet after visits ended. He sometimes walked through the barn and imagined what it would look like empty. That image returned more frequently. The dairy in 1999 lost money again. Not dramatically. Not enough to close the doors. Enough that the custom baling now carried the difference more clearly. Custom work had once been the supplement. It had become the spine. Thomas increased efficiency wherever he could. He shortened lunch breaks. He combined trips between fields. He repaired parts instead of replacing them. He did not cut corners on the baler's maintenance. That machine represented his proof that he had not failed. The meter ticked upward each season. 100,000 bales passed quietly. He did not mark the milestone. He only recalculated what that meant in labor hours. In 2000, he turned 64 and told Anne that 65 might be a good age to consider easing back. She nodded without pressing. She had heard versions of that before. The next season came and nothing changed. He still woke before sunrise. He still checked weather before coffee. He still loaded tools in the truck in case something snapped in the field. In 2001, the co-op introduced new quality standards that required more consistency. Smaller operations like his struggled to smooth production across months. Some checks came in lighter than expected. He absorbed the difference by taking on to additional custom contracts. That was how he solved every shortfall. Add labor, add hours. The logic never shifted. In 2002, Jacob visited with his wife and young child. Thomas watched his grandson toddle near the fence line and felt a brief, sharp awareness that time was moving without him. Jacob asked whether Thomas had considered leasing part of the land and focusing only on the dairy, or only on custom work. Thomas answered that splitting the operation would weaken both sides. What he meant was that choosing one over the other would feel like admitting the original decision had been incomplete. The structure of his life had become an argument in defense of that 1983 choice. Every season survived was evidence. Every year endured was justification. In 2003, the summer heat arrived early. 12 contracts were on the list. The dairy had not improved. Fuel costs rose. Thomas did not calculate retirement. He calculated the next field. The pressure was no longer only financial. It was existential. If he stopped, what would remain? The farm existed because he existed. That realization hovered at the edge of his thoughts, but never crossed fully into acceptance. He believed continuity required presence. He did not consider what absence would reveal. When he collapsed in Roger Dietrich's field in July of 2003, the event felt less like a warning and more like an interruption. In the hospital in Watertown, the doctor explained that he had experienced a significant heart attack. The doctor used words like stress and recovery and reduction. Thomas listened and nodded. He asked how long before he could return to light work. The doctor paused before answering and sat beside the bed and held his hand. She did not cry in front of him. When they returned home for days later, Thomas walked through the barn before sitting down. He said he needed to check on the herd. He returned to Roger's field the following week and finished the job. He rested between passes more often. He ignored the ache in his arm. Customers called to ask whether he was all right. He said yes. The next 2 seasons he reduced his contracts from 12 to 10. He hired a neighbor's son to help with raking and tedding. He allowed the boy to run the baler on easier fields. He told him this was the beginning of slowing down. It looked responsible on the surface. Underneath, nothing fundamental changed. The dairy still lost money. The custom work still filled the gap. The payments still required his oversight. He had not built a system that functioned without him. He had built endurance. In 2004, Paul visited and asked carefully how he was feeling. Thomas answered that he was managing. Paul did not push modernization again. The argument had already been lost years earlier. Instead, Paul suggested that maybe the farm did not need to be saved in the way Thomas imagined. Thomas said nothing. The idea that the farm might end felt like betrayal. He had kept it alive longer than anyone predicted. That mattered. It had to matter. In 2005, he turned 69. He had 8 contracts that season. 8 felt reasonable. 8 felt sustainable. He told Ann that this year was different. He was taking Sundays off more consistently. He even mentioned again the possibility of a short trip to the Black Hills in the fall. The words sounded believable. But sustainability built on exhaustion is temporary. The dairy remained unprofitable. Equipment aged. Margins tightened. His sons were settled elsewhere. The farm's future was not expanding. It was narrowing to him alone. And yet he experienced a strange calm that summer. Fewer contracts meant fewer frantic phone calls. Fields were smaller. The rhythm felt controlled. He mistook that for safety. On August 12th, he drove to Carl Winter's field west of Watertown for a small job. Maybe 150 bales. He started early to avoid heat. The work went smoothly. By mid-morning, he was halfway done. The baler fed evenly. The windrows were clean. For a brief stretch of minutes, everything aligned the way he had always wanted it to, predictable. Contained, sufficient. He shut the tractor down at 10:47 and climbed down to rest. There was no dramatic shift, no thunder, no sudden failure of machinery, only a body that had been asked for too much for too long. He leaned back against the rear tire and closed his eyes. The farm had been kept alive for 22 years beyond the moment most people expected it to fold. He had done that. He had shown up. He had endured. What he had not done was step outside the logic that endurance was the answer to every question. By the time Carl Winters found him hours later, the field was quiet. 73 bales stood lined behind the tractor in straight rows. The engine was off. The machine he chose in 1983 was still attached, ready to continue. Thomas Carlyle was not. The funeral was held on a Saturday because that was the only day. All 4 sons could come at the same time. Jacob drove from Sioux Falls before dawn. Michael came from Rapid City. Paul flew in from Iowa. David left Minnesota the night before. They stood beside their mother at the graveside while the pastor spoke about diligence, faith, stewardship, and a life spent on the land. The words were respectful. They were accurate. They were incomplete. No one said that he had worked himself into the ground. No one said that he had been warned. No one said that endurance had finally demanded its price. In rural counties, effort is not questioned. It is honored. After the service, they returned to the farmhouse and sat around the kitchen table that had held so many arguments disguised as practical discussions. The coffee tasted the same as it always had. The house did not, and said quietly that she could not run the dairy alone. Jacob said he could not leave his job. Michael offered to review the finances and help sort out debts. Paul said he knew someone who might be interested in leasing the land. David remained silent longer than the others. The conversation did not turn dramatic. There was no shouting, only arithmetic. 2 months later, the cows were sold at auction. The sound of hooves in the yard that day carried farther than expected. Equipment went the following spring. Some neighbors attended the sale. They examined the baler carefully before bidding. It still ran clean. It still formed tight bales. It still did exactly what it had been purchased to do. It sold for $2,400. A man remarked that it was in good shape for its age. No one mentioned the cost of its upkeep in human terms. The land was leased to a family from Iowa who planted corn and soybeans. The barn lights went dark most evenings after that, and moved into a small house in Watertown because it was closer to the grocery store, closer to church, closer to medical care. The farmhouse felt too large without the rhythm of milking and machinery. The absence of work was louder than the work had ever been. In the months after the sale, neighbors stopped by to express condolences. Many told the same story. He never missed a cutting. He always showed up. He never left a field half done. Glenn Hoffmer, one of Thomas's earliest customers back in 1983, stood in the kitchen one afternoon and said he had never worked with a more reliable man. He paused before adding that Thomas did not have to work that hard, and looked at him for a long moment and answered, yes, he did. Glenn did not argue because in his own way he understood. Thomas had not been chasing wealth. He had been defending continuity. Vernon Oakes, the dealer who sold him the new Holland 855, had retired in 1999 and moved to Arizona. He learned of Thomas's death nearly a year later when an old contact mentioned it over the phone. Vernon sat in his kitchen thousands of miles from South Dakota and replayed the day in 1983 when Thomas stood between the milking parlor and the used baler. Vernon had known even then that Thomas was choosing the harder road. He had not stopped him because farmers rarely wanted to be stopped. Vernon realized years later that the mistake was not mechanical. The baler had done its job perfectly. It had worked too well. It had provided just enough revenue to prevent collapse, but not enough margin to allow transformation. It had turned survival into a permanent state. Vernon considered calling and to apologize, but could not articulate what he would apologize for. Selling a machine is not the same as designing a life. In 2017, more than a decade after Thomas's death, a man named Russell Kern purchased 120 acres adjoining the old Carlisle place. He was 32, ambitious, and determined to enter farming despite the risks. At an estate sale near Watertown, he noticed an older dark blue round baler sitting in the back of a machine shed. The paint was chipped. The meter read 127,000 bales. He asked about it. The auctioneer said it had once belonged to Thomas Carlisle, had been sold once, then again, and now was here. Russell bought it for $800. He replaced belts, changed fluids, greased fittings, and started it on the second try. That summer it ran without issue. Russell baled his own hay and took on a little custom work to supplement income. He did not know the history of the machine beyond the name. He did not know that it once represented a choice between modernization and stubborn independence. He only knew that it functioned. Machines do not carry philosophy. They carry torque. The baler continued to form tight, even rolls across fields that once belonged to the same rural network Thomas had worked so hard to sustain. It outlasted the dairy. It outlasted the mortgage. It outlasted the man. Back in Watertown, and lived quietly until 2019, when she moved into assisted living at 84. Her sons visited when schedules allowed. Sometimes they spoke about the farm. Sometimes they avoided it. One afternoon, Jacob asked her whether she believed their father had made the right decision in 1983. She was silent long enough that he wondered whether she had not heard him. Then she said he made the only decision he could live with. Jacob asked if that was the same as the right decision. She answered no. That distinction remained unresolved. In town, people still told the story of Thomas Carlyle as an example of grit. They said he kept the farm alive for 22 years after experts predicted its decline. They said he worked harder than anyone. They said he never quit. They did not mention that the farm closed anyway. They did not mention that his sons built lives elsewhere. They did not mention that the land eventually produced corn and soybeans for someone else's balance sheet. Narratives prefer clarity. His life offered complication. The central fact remained simple. He chose endurance over leverage. He chose control over risk. He chose continuity over reinvention. Each of those choices made sense at the moment he made them. None of them were irrational, but together they formed a structure that depended entirely on his continued labor. When that labor stopped, the structure dissolved quickly. Survival is not the same as succession. Hard work is not the same as adaptability. Persistence is not always wisdom. In quiet hours, when wind moved across fields that no longer held Holsteins, and when the barn doors stayed closed, the question lingered without resolution. If a man preserves something by consuming himself, what exactly has been preserved? The farm existed longer because of him. That is undeniable. The farm also ended shortly after him. That is also undeniable. The machine kept running. That detail is often repeated because it feels symbolic. But the deeper symbol is simpler. A decision can be both understandable and costly beyond measure. Thomas Carlyle did not fail in the way failure is usually defined. He paid his debts. He honored contracts. He kept promises. He extended the life of his farm by 2 decades through discipline and effort. The outcome was not dramatic collapse. It was gradual narrowing until there was only one variable left holding everything upright. When that variable disappeared, the rest followed. The story is sometimes told as a tribute to work ethic. It can be heard that way. It can also be heard as a caution about the difference between staying alive and building something that can live without you. On August 12, 2005, he shut off the engine because he intended to rest a moment before finishing the field. That intention captures the entire arc of his life. Just a moment more. Just one more pass. Just one more season before slowing down. The field was half done. The machine was ready to continue. He did not get up, and long after the baler moved on to other hands, long after the cows were gone and the barn quiet, the question remained suspended over the land he once defended. Was endurance enough, or was it simply easier than change? After the equipment sale and the cattle auction, the land did not look dramatically different. Fields remain fields regardless of ownership. Fences stand even when the hands that built them are gone. What changed was rhythm. For decades there had been 2 fixed points in everyday morning milking and evening milking. That rhythm shaped everything else. Without it, time expanded strangely, and felt that first. The house no longer moved around a schedule. No boots by the door before dawn. No engine warming in the yard. No late-night ledger checks at the kitchen table. Silence became the dominant sound. The lease agreement with the family from Iowa was practical and clean. They would plant corn and soybeans. Payments would arrive on schedule. The arrangement was efficient. It was also final. The dairy barn remained standing, but functionally obsolete. Once, neighbors would measure distance by saying, "Just past Carlyle's dairy." Within a few seasons, they said, "Past the old Carlyle place." Language adjusted quickly. Identity did not. Jacob visited less frequently after the sale, not because he did not care, but because there was no work to anchor the visit. Michael helped him navigate paperwork and tax filings. Paul advised on leasing terms. David installed a new router in the Watertown house so Ann could video call her grandchildren. Each son contributed in his own domain. None contributed to the land itself. That fact settled quietly into permanence. When they gathered for holidays, conversation shifted toward careers, schools, mortgages, retirement accounts. The farm entered discussion only when memory prompted it. The new Holland 855 became a small legend among locals for a while. People remarked that it had passed through multiple owners and still ran. Russell Kern put another season on it, then another. He upgraded eventually but kept the old baler as backup. He respected its reliability. He did not attach philosophy to it. For him, it was equipment. For others, it became shorthand for Thomas's endurance. Stories simplify over time. In town, the narrative tightened into something easier to repeat. Thomas had refused to quit. Thomas had extended his farm 22 years beyond expectation. Thomas had died working, which in that community was a form of honor. The part about the farm closing afterward rarely entered the retelling. It complicated the tribute. Vernon Oakes, in Arizona, sometimes replayed the conversation in 1983 with more nuance as he aged. He had sold hundreds of machines in his career. Most were transactional. That one lingered. He did not believe Thomas had made a foolish decision. He believed Thomas had made a decision aligned with his temperament. That alignment was powerful. A man who values control will choose the path that preserves control, even if it costs him rest. A man who values independence will avoid debt even if debt could accelerate growth. These are not errors of intelligence. They are extensions of identity. Vernon concluded that the baler had not trapped Thomas. Thomas had used it exactly as intended to preserve autonomy. The unintended consequence was that autonomy required constant exertion. In assisted living years later, and sometimes sat by the window and watched traffic instead of fields. She did not speak often about regret. When she did, it was not about the machine or the contracts. It was about time. She wondered whether there had been a moment, one specific season, when stepping back would have been possible without collapse. She could not identify it. The years blended. That is the danger of gradual strain. There is rarely a single clear exit. The sons aged into middle life. Jacob moved into management at the feed mill. Michael expanded his accounting practice. Paul rose within the seed company. David built a stable career in IT. Each built security that did not depend on weather forecasts. None described their path as rebellion against their father. It was adaptation. When they thought about him, they did so with respect, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with confusion. They understood why he had chosen as he did. They also understood that they would not have made the same choice. That difference was generational as much as personal. Farming in the 1980s required grit. Farming at the turn of the century required scale or diversification. Thomas had chosen grit and resisted scale. The result was sustainability tied directly to his labor capacity. Once that capacity ended, the system had no redundancy. That is not tragedy in the theatrical sense. It is structural vulnerability. Yet emotion does not respond to structural analysis. Emotion responds to image. The image that remained was simple. A man leaning against a tire, engine off, field half done. That image became symbolic not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. He had intended to finish the field. He had not intended to die. The gap between intention and outcome defines most lives. Over time, the question of whether he had succeeded shifted. If success meant keeping the farm alive longer than predicted, then yes, he succeeded. If success meant passing a thriving operation to the next generation, then no, he did not. If success meant living long enough to enjoy the quiet he promised himself each season, the answer was harder. The farm did not collapse in scandal or bankruptcy. It ended through attrition. That matters. He did not fail spectacularly. He endured privately. For many who heard his story, that endurance felt noble. For others, it felt cautionary. The difference depends on what one believes about sacrifice. Is sacrifice justified by duration alone? Does the act of holding something together validate the cost, even if the outcome is temporary? These questions rarely receive clear answers. They persist because they touch a universal tension between survival and evolution. Russell Kern eventually replaced the old baler with a newer model capable of higher throughput and better efficiency. He sold the 855 to another farmer starting out. The machine moved again, continuing its practical life independent of narrative. It had outlasted economic cycles, ownership changes, and the man who first made it central to his strategy. Tools endure differently than people. Tools do not accumulate fatigue in the same way. They wear, they are repaired, they continue. Humans accumulate decisions. Those decisions form patterns. Patterns become identity. Identity resists alteration. Thomas Carlyle's life can be understood as a series of consistent decisions, aligned with who he believed himself to be. That consistency built strength and limitations simultaneously. In the final analysis, the most honest assessment may be this: he chose the path that allowed him to wake each morning without feeling compromised. He paid for that choice over time in increments small enough to tolerate, until they were no longer tolerable. The farm existed 22 additional years because he refused to relinquish it. It did not exist beyond him because it was never designed to. That dual truth sits at the center of his story. It resists clean moral framing. It invites reflection instead. In places like South Dakota, where land and labor intertwine tightly, stories of endurance are common currency. They affirm values communities depend on. Yet even there, late at night, when wind crosses fields that no longer carry dairy herds and barns stand as silhouettes, rather than workplaces, a quieter thought surfaces. Endurance answers the question of today. It does not always answer the question of tomorrow. Thomas answered today for 22 years. Tomorrow required something else. Whether that something was leverage, change, delegation, or surrender remains debated only in hindsight. He did not operate in hindsight. He operated in weather forecasts and payment schedules and pride inherited from a father who died without debt. On June 14, 1983, he chose a machine that allowed him to continue without borrowing beyond what he could bear. That machine did exactly what it was meant to do. It extended the present. It did not redesign the future. On August 12, 2005, he rested beside it, believing he would finish the job before noon. The engine was off. The field was waiting. For 22 years, he had refused to let unfinished work define him. In the end, the work remained, and he did not. What remains now is not the field or the machine or even the farm. What remains is the question his life leaves behind when survival demands everything you have. Is surviving the same as winning, or is it simply postponing a different ending?